Hey, everybody, and welcome again to the Risk Matrix with James Junkin.
The Risk Matrix, Roll Tide, Go Navy, we're in the house.
And little old me, Dr. Martin. And today we're going to talk about hiring clients and subcontractors and what your responsibility is to monitor what's going on and what your liability and risk turns out like when you don't. So, but first I'm going to roll it to James, and James is going to give us a sponsor statement for this episode.
Today's episode of the Risk Matrix is sponsored by Veriforce Hub partner Trinity Endeavors. Trinity Endeavors is an industrial supply company that prioritizes safety, transparency, and solutions. Veriforce Network members can save 15% off on 4 gas monitors, which are critical tools necessary for working in hazardous atmospheres. For more information, visit trinityendeavors.us/Veriforce Hub offer. Thank you, Trinity Endeavors.
All right, thanks for that, James. Listen, this is a pet peeve of yours. And from listening to you talk about it over the last several weeks of doing audits and looking at people with your proprietary audit software, I'd like to talk about it. Contractors that bring in other people to do the work that they've been contracted to do through a master services agreement or through a contractual arrangement with the hiring organization. And what are their responsibilities when it comes to managing safety or providing a bridging document that tells them what the minimum is, and hopefully they do better, but what the minimum is required for safety.
I think you got to begin with the hiring client needs to make a decision of whether or not the contractor that they vetted, that they pre-qualified, that they've gone through and they have an MSA with and insurance with, whether they're going to allow that contractor to engage other contractors in a subcontractor relationship or not. That's really based on your risk profile and good pre-qualification, understanding, and good communication and good MSAs or contracts, so that you can know right up front, hey, we're going to allow these contractors to add subcontractors or we're not. In many cases, what I'm finding is the hiring clients are ignorant of the fact that it's not the employees of the person they selected to do the work that are actually out there performing the work. I had a situation about 6 months ago with a hiring client in the oil and gas industry that ended up with a subcontractor out there. They had no visibility. They didn't know who this company was. This company did not have any insurance whatsoever. And next thing you know, that company has a fatality. And the questions are then asked, why didn't we catch this ahead of time? So from a contractual standpoint, are you going to allow it? Now, subcontractors are valuable. Sometimes they can provide tools and services that the primary contractor cannot perform, right? Mm-hmm. But we need a better understanding, because lately in assessments I'm doing, I'm finding contractors who do not understand what their responsibilities are when it comes to hiring subcontractors. They understand what their responsibilities are between their company and the hiring client, but they're failing to understand that every word that it says, ABC contractor inside the MSA is responsible for doing these things. If I hire a subcontractor, it's my responsibility as the contractor to ensure my subcontractors are mirroring those requirements.
Yep. So one of the things that you mentioned to me is, let's just give an example, right? A general contractor obviously doesn't, on a construction site, they generally don't do all the work themselves. They may do some of it, right? They may do the project management. They may do some superintendent work. They may have some laborers, but let's just take, for example, electrical work, right? If I am a general contractor and I hire an electrical subcontractor, I must, and tell me if I get this wrong, if my hiring client or the owner has responsibilities that are conditions, special conditions that I need to comply with, I need to make sure I also have a policy as a contractor, which is what I was talking about, a bridging document,
Right.
so that my electrical subcontractor, regardless of the fact that I don't do any electrical work myself, that my electrical subcontractor knows what the requirements are.
Absolutely. And this is an area in policy and in training and in execution that I find that contractors are failing to do with subcontractors. They may get insurance, right? But your insurance needs to mirror what your responsibility is to the hiring client. So if they're requiring you to have $5 million worth of coverage, then guess what? That subcontractor needs to have $5 million worth of coverage. Many times they don't. Another problem that I've seen in recent assessments, the contractor says, I don't perform electrical work. I don't work at heights. I don't do these things.
Just
Okay.
managing this.
Now,
just managing this.
I'm just managing it. And managing it for some is sending an email and telling folks, hey, work safe. That's not managing it under a contractual relationship. We all understand how third-party verification systems work. We all understand we upload our policies and procedures and they're approved, they're graded, they're whatever. We understand that process. So if you're required to have a fall protection program, right, and you hire a subcontractor to perform that work, you need a program whether you're performing that work or not so they can bridge to it. Right? So what's a bridging document? And there's a lot of confusion about that, but really a bridging document is whose policies we're going to follow. And if we have an incident and we're the contractor and our subcontractor falls from heights, the very first thing that we're going to look for in the investigation is, hey, whose policy were we following? Well, we didn't have a policy. We're the contractor because we don't work at heights. Wait a second. I hired you to do this. You subbed it out. It's your responsibility now as the contractor to represent our interest. Oh man, I didn't know that.
Well, it's easier to check a box and say does not apply, right? Does not apply, does not apply. But I'm going to tie this into the multi-employer worksite regulation, right? If you think of it that way, some way or another, somebody's going to be responsible, and it's probably not just going to be one person, right? If something goes wrong. And so even if you think it does not apply, you better cover yourself, right? How are you going to cover yourself? Are you going to say in your safety manual, how everybody has a nice little health and safety plan for the site, that you're going to say all electrical contractors will use lockout tagout? Is that enough? Is it enough?
I don't think so. And this is my opinion now. I get paid for my opinion, so I'm going to give it.
I'm not paying
If I'm hiring an electrical contractor, then I need a qualified electrical worker program that's been approved by my hiring client that my electrical contractor can bridge to. Now, that's specific based on job scope, but there are a lot of other things that are out there that are hiring client specific. For example, you and I have expressed our views, I think, enough about behavior-based safety, and I'll invite anybody on this show that wants to come debate James. We'll get it on, okay, about behavior-based safety. But it is a theory and it is a methodology that many people still utilize. And so I have contractors who are required to have a behavior-based safety policy and program that is implemented because it's a condition of their contract. It's too late to argue about that once you sign the MSA. If you said you're going to do these observation cards and you're going to track these metrics and these observed behaviors and unsafe acts and corrective actions and all the things that go in the behavior-based safety program, when you hire that subcontractor, guess what you're responsible for?
Mm-hmm.
Verifying that they're doing the same thing. And too many times, what I see is we're signing this in the MSA, but we have no mechanism to manage the subcontractor.
So I think of it this way, if I can interject here. You've got the owner or the hiring body, right? Who
Right.
has an MSA with the general contractor, right? The general contractor lays down the umbrella, the bridge, right? And the subcontractor should have something, and again, I get paid for my opinion too, should have something more stringent, whether it be a more stringent lockout tagout policy specific to the task or JHAs or things that actually speak to their expertise
Right.
to do those tasks, right? So we're not saying, I mean, we get into that whole directing the work thing when you start drilling down with as a general contractor to exactly how they're going to do the job, right? Because you really don't want to do that. However, you're going to have the bridge so that they can create on the other side something a little bit better and a little bit more stringent and a little bit more descriptive to do the job safely.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you see that, when we develop policies and procedures for hiring clients, operators, owners, whatever terminology you want to use, they're depending on their scope of risk and advice from their internal legal counsel. Give you an example, their confined space policy. They may have a policy that says our employees do not go into confined spaces. That's why we hire contractors, right? Mm-hmm. So their policy is going to be less prescriptive and less task oriented than the contractor they're hiring is.
Yep.
So then if that contractor is going to sub that out, as we get closer to the point of operation, the actual people who are going to go out and do the work that are going to be exposed to the hazards, then those folks need probably the best program, the most descriptive, because that is the plan of action that they're going to use to go out there and perform the task. But that's not what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Okay. What I'm seeing is the further down the chain we get from the contractor, the less verification we have of their policies, their procedures, their training, the qualifications of people to perform their job and to do it safely, and all the other things that come along, like I just mentioned with behavior-based safety. So as a contractor, my responsibility when I hire sub is to stand in place of my customer. So let's get to this. What sort of pre-qualification are you doing of your subcontractor?
And what kind of pre-qualification are they doing of their subcontractors? If I've
Right.
seen it once, I've seen it 100 times. You go into an accident investigation or incident investigation, and everybody's there, and somebody shows up and they're like, we're XYZ from this company. And the general contractor goes, now who is that? Right. And what has happened is, and you mentioned this earlier in the show, right? The owner hired the general contractor, the general contractor hired the sub, and they might have a bridging document to that first sub, but the responsibility of that sub when they hire another sub and they hire another sub has to be in their contract and also has to be monitored from the top down.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's important to have these lines clearly defined about responsibility. If you saw me, I just looked down at my phone. I've got a case right now, just happened yesterday, where it involves multiple contractors on a site where one of them got severely injured, and the contractor I represent is involved in the operation that resulted in the injury. So now everybody's like, who's at fault? Who's to blame? blame is the enemy of understanding, but we all know in a serious injury or fatality, we may be headed to court, and court is where blame is assigned.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding who's responsible for what is very important. It's very important. Now, I want to talk about pre-qualification. Pre-qualification is not qualification. Sometimes I hear this. As a contractor, my subs are required to be in XYZ pre-qualification system. They're required to have a Veriforce account, for example, right? But if you pull out the MSA requires of you things that are not monitored by Veriforce. For example, your behavior-based safety program, if you have that, that's a good example. Veriforce is not looking at your behavior-based safety cards. They're not helping with your incident and accident investigations to determine the methodologies you're going to use and whether you're really digging into the causal factors. They're not tracking unsafe acts and all these other things that end up in MSAs that you're supposed to be providing to the hiring client. Then these groups should be hiring for you. When you
Everything
select your
rolls down and everything rolls up.
Absolutely. When you select your subcontractor, what is the cutoff on the TRIR or EMR? Now, we can have this great debate about whether looking at a TRIR is generally reflective of a company's overall safety management system some other day. I think everybody understands how I feel about that. But look, I didn't write the MSA. I'm just telling you what's in it.
We already had that conversation today, James. We had an hour conversation this morning about TRIR and a bunch of this stuff. So let's save that for another day. So go ahead.
But if the risk profile within your MSA says you must have to work for us without a waiver a TRIR of 1, then guess what? Your subs need that too. Who's verifying that? If it says your EMR must be this, who's verifying that?
Who's qualifying them, right? They're pre-qualifying by uploading a ton of stuff into a database, right? And they get the green means go, right? And we can talk about that another day. They get the green means go, and then we do nothing else, right? And so another topic for another day, right, is what I call the super audit, right? The preemptive super audit, which back in the day used to be you and I going through, all the subs and helping select the subs based on their safety criteria and whatever. And there's got to be a better way, right? Because a lot of companies don't want to spend the money for the super audit, right? A super audit in advance of something happening. And, that you call it a deep dive super audit, right? And without that, just my opinion, you're not qualified, right? There's got to be something that qualifies you beyond pre-qualification.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And look, pre-qualification is a useful tool to begin the vetting process for a contractor. Pre-qualification software like Veriforce uses helps streamline the process that used to be a manual process, right? It used to be a manual process. We all went out there. Actually, PEC Safety, who is a legacy company of Veriforce, was the first to come up with a standardized safety questionnaire. So you don't have to answer these pre-quals over and over and over and answer the same thing. Do you have safety meetings? Do you train your people? Do you check your fire extinguishers? Do you do incident investigations? All these things we're answering yes over and over and over again. So it's a very useful tool to streamline that process. And you can share that information amongst different hiring clients. But moving forward beyond pre-qualification, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about, do you actually do what you say you do? And I find the only way to do that is what we call a deep dive contractor assessment that looks at not only the safety practices that you say you do, are you doing them, right? From a compliance and contractual standpoint, but how are you managing your subcontractor? And typically in MSAs, just having a subcontractor have a good score in a third-party verification system is not enough.
Mhm.
And what I find is people are super happy to get work. They sign these MSAs and they don't know what's in them.
Mhm.
And you know when it comes out?
When
When
something
somebody
happens.
gets hurt
Yeah.
or we tear something up
And
or
everybody's doing
damage
this.
the environment, right?
That
So
guy.
if it's one of your subcontractors, you're responsible for that. So here's questions. If I was a contractor, contractor safety professional, that I would be asking myself if I'm using subs. Number one, what does our MSA say our responsibilities are with regards to subcontractors? Can we use them or can't we use them? All right. If we use them, what are the other add-on responsibilities that the hiring client is asking of me that's outside of the normal regulations for federal OSHA, state OSHA, things of that nature, right? So we all know we got to comply with the regulation, but what are things like, what kind of metrics am I supposed to be tracking? Am I supposed to be submitting leading indicators, lagging indicators, that kind of stuff?
Yep.
Find out what those are. Then create a written subcontractor management policy. This is my policy. We're going to make our subcontractors adhere to, at a minimum, the risk qualification for our hiring client.
Mhm.
Now, this is when you got to sit down and talk to management, right? Because some hiring clients may have more risk tolerance than you have. So if you're using, for example, total recordable injury rate as a statistic, and your company says 1, but the hiring client says 2, then you're being more restrictive, and that's fine. Then you need to communicate with your subcontractors what their requirements are. And usually these are smaller companies, right? Who are probably very good at what they do, but common deficiencies I find is training. If we hire a subcontractor and they go out on a location and they've not been trained in fall protection, next thing you know, they're out there working at heights and there's an incident, it could all have been prevented potentially by us asking that question on the front end. So whether you're using a deep dive contractor assessment or you're doing it yourself, you need visibility into these folks' safety programs, other qualifications. Hey, rigging, operating heavy equipment, forklift operators. You mentioned electricians. Hey, I want to make sure that we have qualified electrical workers under the standard. Now, if they're a card carrying journeyman electrician, then they're going to meet, most likely, 99.9% of the times, the requirements within the standard. But it's your duty as the contractor to assess all of this. Now, I want to say thank you to my fellow safety professionals and your fellow safety professionals. And because I understand how hard a job it is for you to do. Most people think all we do, Dr. Martin, is run around and check people's PPE. I wish that's all I had to do. If you're going to hire subs, you need some way to track their insurance, to know when it expires, to make sure you have COIs on file. Maybe that's your job as a safety professional. Maybe you've got a risk manager. Maybe there's somebody else within your organization accounting that can keep up with it, but somebody needs to be keeping up with it. Because I've had multiple cases in the last 3 years alone where a subcontractor employee got injured and the subcontractor didn't have workers' comp.
Yep, seen it too.
Okay. So there's a legal side of occupational safety and health. And one of these days, we're going to get Brick Kettlecamp on from Ogletree and Deacons and talk to him about these type of issues. But from a safety standpoint, subcontractors, they sometimes represent increased risk for the hiring client because the hiring client doesn't even know they're there.
Right. Totally agree.
Have a plan.
Have a plan and make sure you're keeping an eye on things down and what rolls up and what your requirements are. So I think that's all we have for today, James, unless you got something else. I think we've alluded to some of the other things we're going to talk about in the next coming months. We've got lots to talk about. I want to talk about communication, all kinds of stuff. But thank you again for listening to the Risk Matrix. If you're listening to us, make sure you subscribe to our channel here on YouTube. Put your comments, follow us, and let us know what you think, or questions you have, or topics that you want to hear us talk about, or even guests.
Hey, before we go, appreciate you if you go out there and you follow us on LinkedIn, hit that subscribe button. Share the post. The post comes out every Tuesday from Veriforce at sometime in the afternoon, typically Eastern Standard Time. Hit over there, hit that share it to your network. We'd love to get the word out about the podcast, the video cast here. But until then, thank you for following us, and y'all keep bringing those workers home safe.